You obviously don't eat at places like this very often, do you? Patricia Wilson's voice dripped with condescension as she looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant stuck to her designer shoe. I smiled sweetly and adjusted my simple cardigan, letting her think she'd just delivered the insult of the century. What she didn't know was that I could buy this entire restaurant with the loose change in my investment account. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. My name is Monica Thompson, I'm 62, and until 20 minutes ago, I thought I was just a retired Spanish teacher meeting my future in-laws for the first time. Now I realize I'm apparently starring in some twisted social experiment where rich people see how badly they can treat someone they think is beneath them. The joke, as they say, is about to be on them. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up standing outside Manhattan's most exclusive steakhouse, dressed like I shopped at thrift stores, while my son David fidgeted nervously beside me. 4 years ago, my husband Charles passed away, leaving me his insurance company and what you might call a comfortable nest egg. $6 million comfortable, to be exact. I sold the business 18 months later, moved from our mansion to a cozy beach apartment in Sarasota, and started teaching Spanish online. Not because I needed the money, but because I liked staying busy and helping people learn something beautiful. Charles had built Thompson Insurance into one of the most respected commercial insurers in the tri-state area, handling major office buildings, shopping centers, and industrial complexes from New York to Pennsylvania. When we started out 40 years ago, we covered small businesses and residential properties. By the time I sold it, we were handling some of the most prestigious commercial real estate in the region. Not the biggest company in the industry, but definitely one of the most trusted. David had always been independent, just like his father. Full scholarship to Northwestern, worked his way through law school, never asked for a penny. He had no idea about the real size of his inheritance because, honestly, he'd never shown any interest in money beyond earning his own. Charles had deliberately kept business conversations away from the dinner table, wanting David to find his own path without the pressure of family expectations. When he called 3 weeks ago, practically glowing through the phone about this amazing woman named Brittany, I was thrilled. My boy was in love. "Mom, I want you to meet her parents before I propose," he'd said, his voice full of that nervous excitement that reminded me of when he was 7 and had found the perfect Mother's Day gift. I'm thinking of popping the question right there at dinner in front of everyone. Standing here now, watching Brittany scroll through her phone while completely ignoring my existence, I'm getting a very different picture of this romance. She's gorgeous, I'll give her that. The kind of Instagram-perfect beautiful that probably photographs well next to expensive handbags and tropical vacations. But in the 10 minutes since David introduced us, she hasn't made eye contact once, answered my questions with distracted mm-hmms, and seems more interested in her social media followers than her potential future mother-in-law. The restaurant itself is intimidating by design. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble everything, and the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they're posing for a magazine cover. The hostess, a statuesque brunette with the practiced smile of someone who judges your net worth by your accessories, kept glancing at my simple clothes with barely concealed confusion. I could practically hear her thinking, "What is this woman doing here?" David, bless his heart, was trying so hard to make this work. He'd worn his best suit, the navy one we'd picked out together for job interviews 3 years ago, and kept smoothing his tie like he was preparing for the most important presentation of his life, which in a way, he was. "They should be here any minute," he said for the 3rd time, checking his watch. "Dad always runs exactly 5 minutes late to make an entrance." Brittany finally looked up from her phone long enough to sigh dramatically. "David, your mother's cardigan is from Walmart. Couldn't you have given her some guidance about tonight?" The words hit like a slap, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of teaching middle school had given me an excellent poker face. David's face flushed red, and I watched him make a choice. Would he defend his mother or keep the peace with his girlfriend? "Brittany," he said quietly, "that's not appropriate." Before she could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the valet stand, and out stepped Patricia and Robert Wilson. Even from a distance, I could see they were the kind of people who expected the world to rearrange itself around their convenience. Patricia emerged first, all sharp angles and expensive highlights, wearing what was probably a month of most people's salary. Robert followed, the type of man who'd perfected the art of looking important while doing very little. They approached our little group with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world. Patricia's eyes swept over David with approval, lingered on Brittany with satisfaction, and then landed on me with the kind of look usually reserved for roadkill. "So," Robert said, extending a hand to David with the firm grip of someone closing a business deal, "you must be the lawyer we've heard so much about." "Actually, I'm corporate counsel for Morrison Industries," David corrected politely. "Ah, Morrison." Robert's smile widened. "Good company. Good benefits, I assume." Before David could answer, Patricia had completed her assessment of me and clearly found me wanting. Her greeting was the social equivalent of a pat on the head you'd give a child you'd rather not acknowledge. "And you must be David's mother," she said, the words somehow managing to sound like both a question and a diagnosis. I smiled my warmest smile, the one I'd perfected during 30 years of parent-teacher conferences. "Monica Thompson. So lovely to meet you both." "Monica." Patricia repeated my name like she was testing how it sounded with her accent. "And what do you do, Monica?" Here it was, the moment of truth. I could tell them about Charles's company, about the investment portfolio that generated more passive income than most people's salaries, about the house in Sarasota that I'd paid for in cash. Or I could have a little fun. "I'm a teacher," I said simply. The change in their expressions was immediate and unmistakable. Patricia's polite smile became strained. Robert's posture shifted slightly, the way people do when they realize they're talking to someone they consider insignificant. "How nice," Patricia said in the tone people use when they mean the exact opposite. "Public or private?" "I teach Spanish online now, but I spent most of my career in public schools." The silence that followed was loaded with judgment. I could practically see them recalculating David's social value based on his mother's perceived economic status. "Well," Robert said, recovering first, "shall we go in? I'm sure they're holding our table." As we walked toward the entrance, Patricia fell into step beside me. "You must be so excited," she said, her voice sugary sweet with manufactured enthusiasm. "This is probably quite an adventure for you." And that's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that tonight was going to be very interesting indeed. The hostess led us through the restaurant like she was conducting a tour of someone else's life, past tables filled with people who belonged in magazines. I kept my expression pleasantly neutral, while Patricia Wilson made sure everyone within earshot knew exactly how she felt about our little group. "Table for 5 under Wilson," Robert announced, the way kings probably used to announce their arrival at court. "Of course, Mr. Wilson. Right this way." The hostess practically curtsied. As we wound through the dining room, I caught Patricia murmuring to Robert, just loud enough for me to hear, "I told you we should have picked somewhere more accessible for everyone." Translation: somewhere that wouldn't make the poor teacher too uncomfortable. How thoughtful. David was walking behind me, and I could feel his tension like heat radiating from a furnace. Every few steps, he'd clear his throat or adjust his tie, sure signs that my boy was second-guessing every decision that had led to this moment. Brittany, meanwhile, was busy taking selfies with the restaurant's crystal chandelier in the background, apparently preparing to document this milestone for her followers. Our table was positioned perfectly for people watching, which I suspected was exactly what Patricia had requested. Premium location, maximum visibility, ideal for showing off their daughter's catch to anyone who might be interested in their family's social climbing. "Isn't this lovely?" Patricia gushed as we settled into our seats. "Monica, have you ever been somewhere quite this elegant before?" The question was designed to highlight what she assumed was the difference between their world and mine. I smiled and looked around appreciatively, taking in the familiar sight of crystal stemware and white tablecloths that cost more than some people's cars. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "Very impressive." Patricia's smile sharpened. "Yes, we've been members here for years. The wine list alone is worth the membership fee. Though I suppose wine isn't something do you drink wine, Monica?" "Occasionally," I replied, not mentioning that Charles and I had spent our anniversary 5 years ago in Tuscany, learning about vintages from winemakers who'd been perfecting their craft for generations. The waiter appeared. Professionally attentive, in the way that suggested he'd sized up our table and identified exactly who would be handling the bill. "Good evening. May I start you with some champagne? We have a lovely vintage Dom Pérignon." "Absolutely," Robert said, without consulting anyone else. "Bring us a bottle." David shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Wilson, that's really not necessary. I can—" "Nonsense," Robert waved him off. "This is a celebration, future family and all that." He winked at Brittany, who was finally paying attention to something other than her phone. When the champagne arrived, along with a recitation of its pedigree that made it sound like liquid gold, I watched Patricia's face light up with anticipation. This was her element: expensive things, exclusive experiences, and the opportunity to make someone else feel small by comparison. "A toast," Robert announced, raising his glass, "to new family connections and—" His eyes met mine with what he probably thought was kindness. "New experiences for everyone." We all raised our glasses, though David looked like he was drinking poison instead of champagne. I took a small sip and nodded appreciatively. It was excellent, though not quite as good as the bottle Charles and I had shared celebrating our 20th anniversary, but I kept that observation to myself. "So, Monica," Patricia began, settling in for what I recognized as an interrogation disguised as conversation, "tell us about your teaching career. It must be so rewarding working with children." "It was," I agreed, "though now I mostly work with adults who want to learn Spanish for business or travel." "Online, you said?" Robert asked, the way someone might ask about a hobby involving collecting stamps or training hamsters. "Yes, it's quite convenient. I can work from anywhere, really." "How modern," Patricia said, with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a particularly interesting case of food poisoning. "And the pay is adequate?" There it was, the money question, delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. David's face flushed crimson. "Patricia, that's really not—" "Oh, it's fine," I interrupted smoothly. "I make enough to keep myself comfortable." Patricia's expression suggested she found my definition of comfortable deeply suspicious. "And where do you live, dear?" "Sarasota. I have a small place near the beach." "How nice," she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "Rent, I assume?" This was getting fun. "No, I own it." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by skepticism. "A little beach cottage. How charming." Brittany, who had been largely silent except for the occasional photo opportunity, suddenly perked up. "David told me you sold your house after your husband died. Was the mortgage too much to handle on a teacher's pension?" The question was asked with such calculated innocence that I almost admired her technique. Almost. "Actually, I sold because I wanted something smaller and more manageable," I replied. "The old house had too many memories." "Of course," Patricia nodded with manufactured sympathy. "These older homes can be such money pits. The maintenance alone must have been overwhelming for someone in your situation." David was gripping his champagne flute so tightly I worried it might shatter. "Mom's house was beautiful," he said firmly. "She and Dad worked very hard for everything they had." "Oh, I'm sure they did," Robert said, his tone suggesting he was humoring a child. "Public service is so important, even if it's not financially— what's the word I'm looking for? Rewarding?" Patricia supplied helpfully. "Exactly, not financially rewarding." I took another sip of my champagne and wondered how long I should let this continue before I started having some real fun. The evening was young, and these people were just getting warmed up. "Your husband," Patricia continued, "what did he do? Was he in education as well?" "Charles was in insurance," I said simply. "Ah, insurance," Robert nodded. "Claims processing, sales?" Here was another delicious moment of choice. "He had his own company," I said mildly. The slight pause that followed was filled with rapid recalculation. Patricia's smile became a little more strained. "A small local agency," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Something like that," I agreed, not mentioning that Thompson Insurance had handled policies for major commercial properties across 3 states before I sold it. Brittany was watching this exchange with growing confusion, clearly not understanding why her parents seemed slightly less confident than they had 5 minutes ago. "Well," she said brightly, "the important thing is that David is successful now. He's nothing like—" She caught herself mid-sentence. "Nothing like what?" David asked quietly. "I just meant—" "You've really made something of yourself," she backtracked quickly. But the damage was done. I could see in David's face that he was beginning to understand exactly what his girlfriend and her parents thought of his background, his family, and by extension, him. The waiter returned to take our dinner orders, and I settled back to enjoy what was shaping up to be the most entertaining evening I'd had in months. The appetizers arrived with the kind of theatrical presentation that made Patricia practically purr with satisfaction. "Oysters for the table," she'd announced, because Monica probably hasn't had many opportunities to try them. I bit my tongue to keep from mentioning that Charles and I used to visit Cape Cod every summer specifically for the oysters. But I was enjoying this little performance too much to interrupt. "Now, Monica," Robert said, attacking his oysters with the confidence of a man who'd never met a mollusk he couldn't conquer. "David tells us you've been very supportive of his career." "I'm proud of him," I said simply, watching my son's face as he tried to navigate the increasingly choppy waters of this conversation. "As you should be," Patricia added graciously. "It must be such a relief to know he can take care of himself financially. No more worrying about being dependent on family." The word dependent hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. David's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Mom has never been dependent on anyone," he said carefully. "Of course not." Brittany jumped in with the kind of false brightness that suggested she'd practiced this conversation. "But it's so nice when children can become independent, you know? No more having to help with bills or worry about retirement planning." I smiled serenely while calculating exactly how much money I'd made in the time it took her to deliver that little speech. My investment portfolio was performing particularly well this quarter. "David has always been self-sufficient," I agreed. "Even in college, he worked to pay his own expenses." "How admirable," Robert said. "Character building. I always believe young people should understand the value of hard work, even if they don't technically need to." The implication was clear. Their daughter had never needed to work for anything, and they were proud of it. The waiter appeared to refill our champagne glasses, and I noticed Patricia was becoming more animated with each sip. This was when people usually became really honest about what they thought. "You know, Monica," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "we should talk about the wedding planning. I assume you'll want to contribute something, even if it's just symbolic." David nearly choked on his champagne. "We haven't even talked about getting engaged yet." "Oh, please," Brittany laughed. "You've been carrying that ring box around for weeks. I've seen the outline in your jacket pocket." My son's face turned 3 shades of red. So much for romantic surprises. "The ring," Patricia continued smoothly. "I'm sure it's lovely, meaningful. Sometimes the most precious things aren't necessarily the most expensive." "Are they, Monica?" Another trap, beautifully laid. She was assuming I'd given David some modest family heirloom, probably with more sentimental value than actual worth. "I wouldn't know," I said honestly. "David picked it out himself." This seemed to throw them slightly off balance. A man who paid for his own engagement ring? How middle class. "Well," Robert recovered quickly, "the important thing is the thought behind it. Though I have to say, Brittany has exquisite taste. She's quite particular about quality." Brittany giggled. "Daddy always says I have champagne tastes. And champagne budget to match," he added proudly. I was beginning to understand the family dynamic here. Brittany was the princess, Robert was the king bankrolling her lifestyle, and Patricia was the queen ensuring everyone knew their place in the hierarchy. My son, apparently, was cast as the useful prince who could provide status and stability while they maintained control. "Speaking of budgets," Patricia said, turning back to me with renewed focus, "we should probably discuss expectations for the wedding. The Wilson family has certain standards we like to maintain." "Of course," I said mildly. "The venue alone will be quite substantial. We're thinking the Plaza or perhaps the St. Regis, somewhere that photographs well." She paused delicately. "I realize that might be ambitious from your perspective." David's jaw was clenched so tightly I worried about his dental work. "Patricia, I think—" "It's fine, sweetheart," I interrupted. "I understand they want the best for Brittany." "Exactly," Patricia beamed. "You're so understanding. Some people get their feelings hurt when they can't participate fully in these kinds of celebrations. The important thing," Robert added magnanimously, "is that everyone contributes what they can. Every little bit helps." I took a sip of champagne and decided it was time to test just how deep their assumptions ran. What kind of budget are we talking about? The three of them exchanged glances, probably debating how to break this gently to the poor teacher who lived in a beach cottage. Well, Brittany said carefully, I was thinking something around 200,000, nothing too extravagant. David's fork clattered to his plate. $200,000? That's for everything, she said defensively. Venue, flowers, dress, honeymoon. Really, it's quite reasonable for the kind of wedding I've always dreamed of. What I've always dreamed of, Patricia corrected. We've been planning Brittany's wedding since she was 12, and we're prepared to handle the bulk of it, Robert assured us. We wouldn't expect you to cover more than, say, 10 or 15%. Just something to show you're invested in their future together. The mathematics were simple. They wanted $15,000 to $30,000 from a woman they believed lived on a teacher's pension and owned a small beach cottage. I had to admire their optimism, if not their compassion. That's very generous of you, I said. We think so, Patricia agreed. Family should support each other, don't you think? I was about to answer when something caught my eye across the restaurant. A man in a chef's coat was walking toward our table, and his face was breaking into a smile of recognition. Oh, this was about to get interesting. Mrs. Thompson, the chef's voice carried across the dining room as he approached our table with a bottle of what looked like very expensive champagne. I can't believe it's you. The conversation at our table stopped mid-sentence. Patricia's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, and Robert's expression shifted from confident superiority to confused wariness. Brittany looked around as if she expected hidden cameras to emerge from behind the potted plants. Chef Morrison, I said warmly, standing to accept his enthusiastic handshake. How wonderful to see you again. Please, please sit, he insisted, gesturing to the server behind him who was carrying what appeared to be the restaurant's finest champagne. This is from our private reserve, the 1996 Krug, with our compliments. I could feel 4 pairs of eyes boring into me as Chef Morrison continued, his voice carrying the kind of genuine gratitude that can't be faked. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing the table, you're dining with the woman who saved our restaurant. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the jazz quartet playing 3 tables away. Patricia's mouth was slightly open. Robert was blinking rapidly like a man trying to clear his vision, and Brittany was staring at me as if I'd just materialized from another dimension. David, bless him, looked completely lost. Saved the restaurant? He repeated weakly. Chef Morrison nodded enthusiastically. 2 years ago, we had a kitchen fire. Devastating. The insurance company wanted to total us out, said it would be cheaper than repairs. We were looking at bankruptcy, 30 years of work down the drain. He turned to me with something approaching reverence. Then, Thompson Insurance stepped in. I maintained my pleasant smile while watching Patricia's face cycle through several distinct stages of shock. Thompson Insurance. Robert's voice came out as something closer to a squeak than his usual authoritative tone. Mrs. Thompson's company didn't just approve our claim, Chef Morrison continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to tell this story. They sent their own team of specialists, worked with the best restoration companies in the city, made sure we could rebuild better than before. Most insurance companies would have cut us a check and walked away. Thompson Insurance treated us like family. The server finished pouring the champagne into fresh glasses, and Chef Morrison raised his in a toast. To Mrs. Thompson, who believed in preserving something beautiful when it would have been easier to let it disappear. As he walked away, promising to send out their signature dessert, I settled back into my chair and took a sip of champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Patricia's jewelry clinking as her hands trembled slightly. Your company, Robert finally managed. Was Thompson Insurance, I confirmed calmly. Was? Brittany's voice was barely a whisper. I sold it after Charles died. The new owners kept the name, but I felt it was time to simplify my life. David was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Mom, you never said... I knew Dad had an insurance agency, but it grew over the years, I said simply. Patricia had recovered enough to speak, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. How large? What kind of policies did you handle? Commercial real estate, mostly. Some personal lines for high-net-worth clients. I paused delicately, We covered major buildings throughout New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania by the time I sold. The mathematics were starting to sink in. I could see Robert doing calculations in his head, probably wondering what that level of commercial coverage might represent in annual premiums. "The sale," he said carefully. "That must have been substantial." "It was adequate," I replied, using their own word back at them. Brittany was now looking at David with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been respect, or it might have been the look of someone recalculating the value of a stock she'd been planning to sell. "David," she said slowly, "you never mentioned—" "I didn't know," he interrupted honestly. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me how big the company was?" "You never asked," I said truthfully. "And you were so proud of making your own way. I didn't want to overshadow that." The entire dynamic at the table had shifted like sand in an earthquake. Patricia, who had been treating me like an elderly relative they had to tolerate at family gatherings, was now looking at me with the kind of calculation usually reserved for tax assessments. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice now honeyed with a respect that had been notably absent an hour ago. "We had no idea. You're so modest." "I prefer simple living," I replied. "Money doesn't have to be complicated." Robert was nodding eagerly now, probably wondering if he'd burned any bridges that could still be rebuilt. "Absolutely. Wise financial planning, keeping things low-key, very smart approach." "Speaking of the wedding," Brittany said, her voice now bright with renewed enthusiasm, "maybe we should think bigger. I mean, if we're really becoming family, shouldn't we celebrate properly?" I looked at David, who was watching this transformation with growing understanding. My boy was finally seeing these people for exactly what they were, and I could tell he didn't like what he was learning. "David," I said gently, "weren't you planning to ask Brittany something tonight?" He reached into his jacket pocket and felt for the ring box, his expression thoughtful. For a long moment, he just sat there, looking at the woman he'd thought he wanted to marry, then at her parents, who were now practically radiating false friendliness. "You know what?" he said slowly, pulling his hand back out empty. "I think I need to give this more thought." The way Brittany's face fell told me everything I needed to know about what she'd really been excited about. It wasn't my son she'd been interested in marrying, and that's when I knew tonight had been worth every minute of theater. The transformation was immediate and complete. Within minutes of Chef Morrison's revelation, Patricia had morphed from condescending socialite to my new best friend. Robert had developed a sudden fascination with my investment strategies, and Brittany was hanging on my every word like I was dispensing financial wisdom from the oracle at Delphi. "You must have such interesting stories from the insurance world," Patricia gushed, leaning forward with the kind of intense attention she'd been reserving for her reflection in her champagne glass. "All those important clients, major business decisions. I bet you've dealt with some of the most influential people in the region." I sipped my champagne and watched her perform. The work was mostly about solving problems for people when they needed help most. Of course, Robert jumped in. Public service in a way, though with such significant compensation. He paused delicately. The sale of the business must have been quite lucrative. "Robert," Patricia scolded with fake embarrassment, "you can't just ask about someone's personal finances." This from the woman who'd spent the first hour of dinner practically auditing my budget. The irony was apparently lost on her. "It's fine," I said graciously. "I was fortunate. Charles built something valuable, and I was able to find the right buyers who wanted to preserve what he'd created." Brittany, who had been unusually quiet since David's announcement about giving things more thought, suddenly perked up. "Mrs. Thompson, you have such an interesting perspective on life. I'd love to spend more time getting to know you better." The same woman who hadn't made eye contact with me for the first 2 hours was now looking at me like I was her long-lost grandmother. "I'd like that too, dear," I replied, "because I'm not completely heartless, even when dealing with gold diggers." David had been watching this entire performance with growing fascination. I could see him processing not just what he was learning about my financial situation, but what he was discovering about the people he'd been planning to make his family. "Brittany," he said quietly, "earlier you mentioned that I was nothing like. What exactly did you mean by that?" She flushed slightly. "I just meant you're so accomplished, so successful." "But nothing like what?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Patricia jumped in to rescue her daughter. She meant nothing like some people who coast by on family money instead of earning their own success. It was a compliment, David. Was it? David's voice was calm, but I recognized the tone. He'd inherited his father's skill for cross-examination. Because it sounded like you were about to say I was nothing like my background. Don't be silly, Brittany laughed, but it came out strained. I love your background. It's so authentic, as opposed to what her own background was, apparently. Robert, sensing dangerous territory, tried to steer the conversation back to safer waters. Monica, I have to ask, what's your secret? Building something that substantial in the insurance industry? No secret, I said. Charles was brilliant with people. I was good with numbers. We listened to our clients and solved their problems instead of trying to minimize our exposure. Fascinating, he said, though I suspected what he found fascinating was the size of the bank account rather than the business philosophy. The entrees arrived, providing a temporary distraction from the awkward undercurrents swirling around our table. I'd ordered the sea base, keeping things simple, while my dining companions had ordered the most expensive items on the menu with considerably more enthusiasm than they'd shown in the first hour. This is delicious, Patricia announced, as if she'd personally discovered flavor. Monica, you simply must try some of this lobster. An hour ago, she'd been worried I couldn't afford the breadbasket. Now she was offering to share her $60 entree. Tell me, Robert said between bites of his Wagyu beef, do you have any plans for your portfolio, investments, real estate, that sort of thing? I could feel David's eyes on me as I considered how to answer. This was exactly the kind of question Charles had taught me to recognize as a fishing expedition. I try to keep things diversified, I said neutrally. Smart? He nodded. Though with your expertise, you probably see opportunities that most people miss. Such as? Well, Brittany and I have been looking at some real estate investments. Nothing too ambitious, just a little development project in the Hamptons. We're always looking for partners with vision. And there it was. The real reason for this sudden change in attitude. I wasn't just David's mother anymore. I was a potential investor in whatever scheme they'd been cooking up. The Hamptons are lovely, I said non-committally. Aren't they? Patricia chimed in. We have a little place there ourselves. Nothing fancy, just 12 bedrooms on the water. Nothing fancy. I almost choked on my wine. David had stopped eating entirely and was just watching this performance with something approaching anthropological fascination. You know, Brittany said suddenly, I think I was wrong about the wedding budget. $200,000 seems so modest for bringing two families together. Does it? David asked quietly. Absolutely, Robert agreed. We should think bigger. Make it really special. I could see exactly where this was heading. Instead of asking for $15,000 from the poor teacher, they were now calculating how much they could extract from the wealthy widow. What did you have in mind? I asked, genuinely curious to see how far they'd push this. Well, Brittany said, her eyes bright with calculations, Daddy knows someone who owns this gorgeous estate in the Hamptons, very exclusive. The kind of place that would really make a statement about what kind of family the Wilsons are. What kind of family they were indeed. David set down his fork and looked at each of them in turn. I think, he said slowly, we should call it a night. The check arrived as if summoned by his words, and I watched Robert's face as he realized the evening's bill was going to be substantial. For a moment, he seemed to debate who should handle it, his eyes darting between David and me like a tennis spectator following a particularly intense rally. Finally, his desire to maintain appearances won out, and he reached for his wallet with the kind of resigned determination usually reserved for root canal procedures. As we prepared to leave, the valet brought my car around first. I tipped him and took my keys, aware that all four of my dining companions were watching with intense curiosity. The 2023 Mercedes-AMG S-Class wasn't ostentatious by my standards, but judging by their expressions, it might as well have been a spaceship. Nice car, Robert said weakly. It's comfortable, I replied. Because it was, and because I enjoyed watching him try to calculate exactly how much I'd paid for it. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, standing under the restaurant's awning in what appeared to be an intense family conference. My phone would probably ring within the hour. The only question was whether it would be David calling to apologize, or Brittany calling to suddenly discover our deep spiritual connection. I was looking forward to finding out. The drive back to my hotel gave me time to process what had just happened. 40 years of marriage to Charles had taught me to read people like quarterly reports, and tonight's dinner had been more revealing than a complete financial audit. The Wilsons weren't just gold diggers, they were strategic gold diggers with a multi-generational plan and the patience to play the long game. My phone rang before I even reached the hotel lobby. David's name flashed on the screen, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice before he said a word. "Mom, I am so sorry." "For what, sweetheart?" "For everything. For not defending you. For letting them treat you like that. For being so blind about what they really wanted." I settled into the comfortable chair by my hotel room window, looking out at the city lights. "You don't owe me an apology, David. You needed to see who they really were. I feel like such an idiot. All those months, thinking Brittany loved me for me when, really..." He trailed off, probably processing the full scope of his miscalculation. "She's very beautiful," I said gently. "And very expensive, apparently." His laugh was bitter. "Did you hear her recalculating the wedding budget in real time? The moment she found out about the insurance company, suddenly $200,000 wasn't enough." I noticed that. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? About the company, about the money, about any of it?" I kicked off my heels and curled up in the chair, remembering a conversation I'd had with Charles years ago about this exact question. "Do you remember when you were 12 and wanted that expensive baseball glove? The Wilson A2000. You made me save my allowance for 6 months. You could have had it immediately. We could have bought you 20 of them without thinking twice, but you earned it and you appreciated it, and you learned something about the value of working for what you want. So you've been teaching me lessons my whole life. I've been letting you become the man you were meant to be without my money getting in the way. There's a difference." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd lost connection. "David, I'm here. I'm just thinking about everything differently now. About Brittany, about her parents, about what they saw when they looked at me." "What do you think they saw?" "A meal ticket. A nice, stable lawyer who could provide for their daughter's lifestyle while they maintained control." His voice turned sharper. "Did you see how they perked up when they started talking about investment opportunities? I swear Robert was about to pitch me a timeshare." That made me laugh. "A development project in the Hamptons?" "Actually, right, because of course it was." I heard him take a deep breath. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Always. Did you dress down tonight on purpose? The simple clothes, the modest answers about your work, all of it?" I considered lying, or at least softening the truth. But David deserved better than that. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted to see how they'd treat someone they thought was beneath them. How they'd treat you when they thought your mother was a liability instead of an asset. And they failed the test spectacularly." Another long pause. "I was going to propose tonight. I had the ring in my pocket. A whole speech planned. I was so nervous about making a good impression." "I know, sweetheart. If you hadn't been there, if I hadn't seen how they really behave when they think no one important is watching, I would have made the biggest mistake of my life. You would have figured it out eventually. Would I? Or would I have spent years making excuses for their behavior, convincing myself that their coldness was just protective instinct?" That was a harder question, and we both knew it. Love makes people willfully blind to red flags that would be obvious to anyone else. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to return the ring and have a very honest conversation with Brittany about what I learned tonight." "That sounds wise." "And then I'm going to take some time to figure out what I actually want in a partner, instead of just being grateful that someone beautiful paid attention to me." My heart broke a little at that last part. "David, you're an amazing man. Any woman would be lucky to have you. Any woman who actually wants me for me, you mean?" "Exactly." I heard him yawn and realized how emotionally exhausting this evening must have been for him. "Get some sleep," I said. "Tomorrow will be better." "Mom, thank you for protecting me, even when I didn't know I needed protection." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the evening's revelations. In the space of 3 hours, I'd watched my son discover that the woman he loved was essentially a high-end escort, that her parents were sophisticated con artists. and that his own mother had been testing them all along. But I'd also watched him make the right choice when it mattered, even though it meant walking away from something he'd thought he wanted. The old Monica might have felt guilty about the deception, about manipulating the situation to expose the truth. But the woman who'd learned to navigate boardrooms full of men who underestimated her, who'd built a company from nothing and sold it for enough money to live comfortably for several lifetimes, knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is make sure someone you care about sees clearly. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I opened it to find a photo of Brittany and her parents at what appeared to be an emergency family meeting in the restaurant's parking lot, along with a message. Mrs. Thompson, I hope we can put tonight's misunderstanding behind us. I'd love to have coffee tomorrow and start over. Brittany. I smiled, deleted the message, and turned off my phone. Some people never learn, but my son, thank goodness, was finally starting to. The city lights twinkled below as I prepared for bed, feeling lighter than I had in months. Tomorrow I'd fly back to Sarasota, to my simple life and my online Spanish students and my peaceful mornings by the beach. But tonight had been worth every moment of theater. The best investments, Charles used to say, weren't always about money. Sometimes they were about protecting the people you love from making choices they'd regret for the rest of their lives. Tonight, I'd gotten an excellent return on both. 5 days after our illuminating dinner, my peaceful Sarasota morning was interrupted by my phone buzzing with the intensity of an angry wasp. Brittany Wilson's name flashed on the screen for the 6th time since yesterday. I let it go to voicemail again, because some conversations are better had when you're fully caffeinated and emotionally prepared for combat. The messages had been escalating in desperation since David called off their engagement. The first was sweetly apologetic, the second was confused and hurt, the third was angry, and this morning's batch had crossed into territory that Charles would have called legally questionable. I was sipping my coffee on the balcony, watching pelicans dive for fish in the Gulf, when David called. Mom, are you okay? Brittany said she's been trying to reach you, and her parents are asking strange questions about our family. I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you holding up? Better than expected, actually. It's amazing how clear everything becomes once you stop making excuses for people. He paused. Though I should warn you, the Wilsons aren't taking this well. That was the understatement of the century. According to David, yesterday's breakup conversation had devolved into Brittany accusing him of leading her on, followed by Robert threatening to make him regret this decision for wasting their daughter's time. Patricia actually suggested I might be having a nervous breakdown, David continued with dark amusement. Apparently, no sane man would walk away from their perfect daughter. How thoughtful of her to provide a medical diagnosis. The best part was when Brittany offered to work on her attitude if I'd reconsider. Like basic human decency was a character flaw she could adjust for the right price. The doorbell interrupted our conversation, which was odd because my building had a security gate and I wasn't expecting anyone. David, I need to go. Someone's at my door. Mom, be careful. Robert made some pretty specific threats yesterday about our family needing to learn some respect. Through my peephole, I saw a young man in a delivery uniform holding an enormous bouquet of white roses. 3 dozen, at least, the kind of arrangement that cost more than most people's monthly car payments. Delivery for Monica Thompson, he announced when I opened the door. The card was written in Patricia's distinctive handwriting. Dear Monica, I hope these beautiful flowers can help us bloom into the friendship we're meant to have. Let's put our little misunderstanding behind us. Call me Patricia Wilson. Little misunderstanding. As if discovering your son's fiancée was a gold digger was just a minor communication hiccup. I was arranging the roses in my largest vase when the phone rang again. This time, it was Robert Wilson himself, his voice carrying the kind of forced joviality that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation. Monica, I hope you received Patricia's flowers. Beautiful, aren't they? They're lovely, thank you. Listen, I think we all got off on the wrong foot the other night. Nerves, you know. Meeting new family is always stressful. I could practically hear him reading from notes. Of course, I said neutrally. The thing is, Patricia and I have been talking, and we realize we may have misjudged your situation. We'd love to have you over for dinner this weekend. Really get to know each other properly. That's very kind, But David and Brittany have decided not to pursue their relationship. Oh, that. He laughed as if David had simply chosen a different entourage. Young people, you know. They have these little disagreements. I'm sure they'll work it out. The confidence in his voice was remarkable. Apparently, in Robert Wilson's world, mere mortals didn't break up with his daughter. They just needed time to come to their senses. Robert, I think David was quite clear about his decision. Monica. His tone shifted to what he probably thought was fatherly wisdom. You're a successful businesswoman. You understand that sometimes the best deals require negotiation, compromise. This isn't a business deal. Isn't it? Though, two families joining resources, building something together. That's exactly what business is. I set down my coffee cup and looked out at the water, where a family of dolphins was playing in the surf. Such simple creatures, with such uncomplicated lives. What exactly are you suggesting? Robert? I'm suggesting we're all adults here. Brittany made some mistakes, said some things she shouldn't have. But she's young, she's learning. With the right guidance, he paused meaningfully, the right family influences, she could become exactly the kind of woman David deserves. And what would this guidance cost? Cost? He laughed, but it sounded strained. Family doesn't cost anything, Monica. Family is an investment. There it was. The real proposal. They wanted to buy their way back into David's life, using my money to finance their daughter's personality makeover. That's an interesting perspective, I said. I knew you'd understand. A woman with your experience, your resources, you know that sometimes you have to invest in potential rather than current reality. Like a fixer-upper. Exactly. You get it. So what do you say? Dinner this weekend? We can discuss how to move forward. I could have ended it there, told him firmly that David had made his choice and it was final. But something in his tone, the casual assumption that my money could solve any problem, including his daughter's fundamental character flaws, sparked the same instinct that had made me test them at the restaurant. I'll think about it, I said. Wonderful. Patricia will be so pleased. She's already planning the menu. After I hung up, I called David back. They want to buy you back, I told him. What do you mean? Robert just offered to have Brittany undergo some sort of personality renovation program, funded by yours truly, to make her worthy of you. The silence stretched so long, I thought we'd lost connection. David? I'm here. I'm just trying to process the fact that they think love is something you can purchase with the right down payment. Apparently, in their world, everything has a price. What did you tell them? I smiled, watching the dolphins play. That I'd think about it. Mom, please tell me you're not actually considering this. Oh, sweetheart, I would never interfere with your happiness for money. But I am curious to see exactly how far they're willing to go to get their hands on my bank account. The laughter in David's voice told me he was finally starting to appreciate the darker humor in this situation. You're going to mess with them, aren't you? I prefer to think of it as conducting market research. Be careful, Mom. These people aren't just greedy. After yesterday, I think they might actually be dangerous. As if summoned by his words, my doorbell rang again. This time it was Patricia Wilson herself, standing on my doorstep with a smile that belonged in a dental advertisement and the kind of determination that suggested she'd driven straight from New York without stopping. Surprise, she announced. I hope you don't mind unexpected visitors. Looking at her perfectly composed face, I realized David might have been right about the dangerous part. Patricia, what a surprise. I stepped back to let her into my apartment, noting how her eyes immediately began cataloging the value of everything in sight. I wasn't expecting you. I know. It's terribly impulsive of me. She swept into my living room like she owned it, her designer heels clicking on my hardwood floors. But after Robert told me about your conversation, I simply couldn't wait. I had to see you in person. She was wearing what probably amounted to a month's salary for most people, her blonde hair styled in a way that defied both gravity and humidity, and her smile was so bright it could have guided ships safely to shore. Please, sit down. Can I get you some coffee? That would be lovely. She settled onto my sofa with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting her entrance techniques. Monica, your home is absolutely charming. So intimate. In Patricia speak, intimate was probably code for smaller than my walk-in closet, but I appreciated the effort. Thank you. I like to keep things simple. Simple can be so refreshing, she agreed, though her expression suggested she found it about as refreshing as a root canal. Especially after the stress of running a major business. You must be enjoying your retirement. I brought her coffee and my second-best china because I wasn't completely heartless. I am, though I stay busy with my teaching and some consulting work. Consulting? Her eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of consulting? Insurance companies sometimes ask for my expertise on complex commercial claims. This was true, though I usually declined these requests because I preferred my peaceful life to the corporate battlefield. How fascinating and lucrative, I imagine. There was Patricia, cutting straight to the chase. No point in pretending this was a social visit. It pays well enough, I said neutrally. She sipped her coffee and looked out at my view of the Gulf. You know, Monica, I owe you an apology. Do you? Absolutely. The other night, I was so nervous about making a good impression that I said some things that came out wrong. I hope you didn't take offense. I almost admired her strategy. Reframe the entire evening as nerves rather than calculated cruelty. I wasn't offended, I said, which was technically true. I'd been amused. Oh, good. Her relief seemed genuine. Because Robert and I have been thinking, and we realize we may have approached this all wrong. How so? Well, we were so focused on Brittany and David that we didn't really consider what this means for us, for our families coming together. She set down her coffee cup and leaned forward with the intensity of someone making a pitch. Monica, you and I, we're both successful women who understand how the world really works. We both want what's best for our children, and frankly, we both have resources that could benefit everyone involved. I'm listening. Brittany is young. She's made some mistakes, said some thoughtless things, but she's not a bad person, just inexperienced in dealing with people from different backgrounds. Different backgrounds. That was rich, coming from someone whose daughter had treated me like something she'd scraped off her shoe. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we invest in her education. Not college, she added quickly, but life education. Travel, cultural experiences, maybe some time working with a charitable organization. Something to broaden her perspective. And this education would cost? Well, that would depend on the scope. A year in Europe, learning about different cultures, working with underprivileged communities, it could be quite transformative. I had to give her credit for creativity. She was essentially asking me to fund a gap year for her adult daughter to learn basic human empathy. That's an interesting idea, I said. Patricia's smile brightened. I knew you'd understand. A woman with your background, your success, you know that sometimes the best investments are in people. And while Brittany is having these life experiences, what would David be doing? Waiting for her, of course. True love is worth waiting for, don't you think? True love. From the woman whose daughter had suggested David was nothing like his background, and whose parents had spent dinner calculating my net worth. How long would this education take? Well, meaningful change doesn't happen overnight. I'd say at least 18 months, maybe 2 years. Enough time for Brittany to really grow as a person. 2 years of keeping David on hold while I funded his ex-fiancee's personal development tour. The audacity was breathtaking. That's quite a commitment, I said. The best things always are. Patricia leaned back, apparently confident she'd made her sale. Of course, we wouldn't expect you to handle all the expenses. Robert and I would contribute what we could. And what amount were you thinking? Well, for a truly comprehensive program, with the right schools and experiences, we'd probably need around $300,000, maybe $400 if we really want to do it right. $400,000 to teach her daughter not to be a terrible person. And that was just Patricia's opening bid. That's quite a substantial investment, I observed. But think of the returns, Monica. A transformed Brittany, a grateful David, 2 families united in a way that honors everyone's contributions. I set down my coffee cup and looked at this woman who had driven 5 hours to sit in my living room and ask me to pay nearly $500,000 to rehabilitate her daughter's character. Patricia, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you actually believe Brittany loves David? The question caught her off guard. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped, and I saw something calculating and cold underneath. Love takes many forms, she said carefully. Brittany appreciates David's stability, his character, his potential. His potential for what? For providing the kind of life she deserves. There it was. The truth, finally. David wasn't a person to them. He was a means to an end. And I wasn't a future family member. I was a financial resource to be exploited. That's an honest answer, I said. Honesty is important in family relationships, Patricia agreed, apparently not realizing she'd just confirmed everything I'd suspected about her daughter's motivations. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, Brittany just called crying, saying her mother is at your house trying to fix everything. Are you okay?" I smiled and typed back. "Having coffee with Patricia, learning a lot about their family values." "Monica?" Patricia's voice interrupted my texting. "You seem distracted." "Just David checking in. He's very protective of his mother. As he should be. You're obviously very important to him. And Brittany is obviously very important to you." "She's everything to me," Patricia said. And for the first time, I heard genuine emotion in her voice. "I just want her to be happy, even if that happiness comes at someone else's expense." The mask snapped back into place. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do." We stared at each other across my coffee table, two women who understood exactly what the other was thinking. The polite pretense had finally worn thin. "Monica," Patricia said slowly, "I think we need to be very clear about what's at stake here." The tone in her voice suggested this conversation was about to take a decidedly different direction. Patricia's smile had vanished completely, replaced by something sharper and considerably less friendly. She set down her coffee cup with the precise control of someone managing their temper, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a subtle edge that raised the hair on my arms. "Monica, I think we've been dancing around the real issue here." "Have we? You seem to think this is some kind of game, that you can manipulate the situation to your advantage." She smoothed her skirt with manicured fingers. "But you're not the only one with resources." I kept my expression neutral, though something cold was settling in my stomach. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that Robert has connections. Important connections. People who could make life very complicated for someone in David's position." There it was. The threat I'd been expecting since David first mentioned Robert's reaction to the breakup. "Are you threatening my son's career?" "I'm simply pointing out that the legal community in New York is smaller than people think. Reputations matter. References matter. Future opportunities depend on maintaining good relationships with the right people." She leaned forward, her eyes hard as diamonds. "David is talented, I'll give him that. But talent only gets you so far without the right connections. And those connections can disappear very quickly when word gets out that someone isn't reliable." "Reliable?" "The kind of man who leads a young woman on for months, lets her plan a future, introduces her to his family, and then abandons her the moment he finds a better financial opportunity." The audacity was staggering. She was rewriting the entire story, casting David as the villain and Brittany as the victim. That's not what happened, isn't it? From where I sit, David pursued my daughter aggressively, made promises about marriage, and then dropped her like yesterday's newspaper the moment he discovered his mother's wealth. That's the story people will hear. I felt my hands clench in my lap. This woman was calmly outlining a plan to destroy my son's reputation with lies, and she was doing it while sitting in my living room drinking my coffee. You can't seriously believe anyone would accept that version of events. "Oh, Monica." Her smile returned, but it was nothing like the synthetic warmth from earlier. "You really don't understand how this works, do you? Truth is whatever the right people say it is. And Robert knows all the right people." She stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the Gulf like she was considering purchasing it. "Your son works for Morrison Industries. Did you know that Robert sits on the advisory board for Morrison's primary insurance provider? Fascinating coincidence, isn't it?" My blood ran cold, even though I remembered what Marcus had told me about these advisory positions being largely ceremonial. "You wouldn't. I wouldn't want to," Patricia corrected. "But if David continues to humiliate my daughter, continues to make our family look foolish, well," she shrugged. "These things have a way of working themselves out. What do you want?" "I want my daughter to be happy. I want David to honor the commitment he made to her. And I want you to stop interfering in their relationship. And if I don't, then David's career takes a very unfortunate turn. Maybe he gets labeled as difficult to work with. Maybe questions arise about his judgment. Maybe opportunities start going to other people. She turned back to face me. The legal field is brutally competitive, Monica. One whisper campaign can end everything he's worked for. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body tense with controlled fury. You're asking me to force my son into a marriage with someone who doesn't love him. I'm asking you to stop sabotaging my daughter's happiness for your own selfish reasons. My selfish reasons? Oh, please. Patricia's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You think I don't see what this is really about? You can't stand the thought of sharing David with another woman. You've kept him dependent on you emotionally, and now that he's found someone who could give him a real future, you're using your money to destroy it. The accusation hit like a physical blow. For a moment, I was too shocked to respond. That's not, isn't it? A lonely widow who can't let go of her son? Who would rather see him alone than happy with someone else? It's textbook, Monica. She gathered her purse with movements sharp enough to cut glass. You have 48 hours to convince David to reconcile with Brittany. A sincere apology, a proper proposal, and a commitment to move forward with the wedding. And if he refuses? Then Monday morning, Robert makes some phone calls. By Wednesday, David's supervisor will be asking questions about his recent performance. By Friday, he'll be looking for a new job. She walked to my front door with the confidence of someone who just played a winning hand. Oh, and Monica, if you're thinking of warning him, don't bother. David won't believe his sweet girlfriend's family could be capable of something so unpleasant. And even if he did, what could he do? Fight a battle he can't win against people he can't afford to make enemies of? After she left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the coffee cups and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: helplessness. Patricia was right about one thing. David would never believe the Wilsons could be this calculating, this cruel. He was a good person who believed other people were fundamentally good too. It was one of the things I loved most about him. And now it was going to be used as a weapon against him. My phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I realized I had to make a choice. Tell him the truth and watch him try to fight a battle he couldn't win, or find another way to protect him. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, you sound strange. What did Patricia want? I looked out at the water, where the dolphins were still playing in the surf, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them. Just to talk, I said. Family things. But as I hung up, I was already forming a plan. Patricia Wilson thought she was the only one who knew how to play hardball. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my former business partner and very old friend, Marcus Chen, who now ran the largest commercial insurance brokerage on the East Coast. Monica Thompson, his familiar voice boomed through the phone. I was wondering when you'd get tired of retirement and come back to play with the big boys. Hello, Marcus. I need a favor. Name it. I still owe you for the Morrison Industries account you threw my way when you sold the company. Morrison Industries. The same Morrison Industries where David worked, and where Robert Wilson apparently thought he had influence. Tell me about Robert Wilson, I said. Bobby Wilson? That pompous windbag from Wilson Financial? What do you want to know? Everything. Marcus's laugh rumbled through the phone. Monica, that man couldn't manage a lemonade stand without going into debt. He talks a big game about his connections, but most of his business comes from one client, his father-in-law's construction company. What about his board positions? Board positions? Plural? Marcus snorted. He's on the advisory board for Morrison's insurance provider, but that's basically a fancy title they give major clients, so they feel important. He has about as much real influence as the company mascot. I felt the first spark of hope I'd had since Patricia's visit. Marcus, I need you to make some calls. Find out everything you can about Wilson Financial's actual position, their debt situation, their client list. And I need it by tomorrow. Consider it done. But Monica, what's this really about? Someone made the mistake of threatening my son. The silence that followed was loaded with understanding. Marcus had known me for 20 years, had seen me demolish competitors who thought they could intimidate Charles or undermine our company. How thoroughly do you want them educated? I don't want them destroyed. Marcus, I want them to understand the difference between having influence and having power. By Thursday afternoon, I had a complete financial profile of Wilson Financial sitting on my kitchen table. The picture it painted was even worse than I'd imagined. Robert Wilson was essentially running a house of cards, using new investments to pay returns to existing clients while skimming management fees off the top. The only thing keeping him afloat was his father-in-law's construction contracts, and according to Marcus's sources, even that relationship was strained due to some questionable billing practices. More importantly, I now knew exactly why they were so desperate to get their hands on my money. My phone rang, and I smiled when I saw the number. "Hello, Robert. Monica. I hope Patricia's visit yesterday was productive. She said you two had a very enlightening conversation." "We certainly did." "Excellent. So I assume you've had time to think about our proposal regarding Brittany's education?" "I have. And I think it's a wonderful idea. In fact, I'm prepared to fund the entire program myself." The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if he'd fainted. The entire program? $400,000, wasn't it? To help Brittany become the woman David deserves? Yes, that's right. Perfect. I'll have my attorney draw up the paperwork. Of course, given the amount involved, I'll need to do some due diligence on your family's financial situation. Standard procedure for any significant investment. Due diligence? Oh, nothing invasive. Just basic financial statements, tax returns for the last 5 years, a credit report. My fiduciary responsibility, you understand. Another long silence. "Monica, I'm not sure that's necessary. This is a family matter, not a business transaction." "Robert, $400,000 is always a business transaction. Surely a man with your experience understands that." I could practically hear him sweating through the phone. "Perhaps we should discuss this in person." "Absolutely. Why don't you and Patricia come down to Sarasota this weekend? Bring Brittany too. I'd love to meet with your financial advisor and really understand how this education program would work." "Our financial advisor?" "Of course. A family of your obvious success must have excellent professional guidance. I'm looking forward to comparing strategies." When he hung up, claiming he needed to coordinate schedules, I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. My phone immediately rang again. This time it was David. "Mom, what's going on? Brittany just called me crying, saying her parents are freaking out about some financial audit." "No audit, sweetheart. I'm just doing my homework before making an investment." "What investment?" "The Wilsons think I should pay for Brittany's character improvement program. $400,000 to teach her basic human decency." The silence was deafening. "Mom, please tell me you didn't agree to that." "I did." "Why?" "Because sometimes the best way to win a chess game is to let your opponent think they're winning until the very last move." "What are you talking about?" "David, what do you know about Wilson Financial?" "Nothing." "Why?" "Because I spent today learning that your ex-fiance's family is essentially broke. They owe more money than most small countries, and the only thing keeping them out of bankruptcy court is Robert's father-in-law's construction business." I could hear David processing this information. "So when they asked you for $400,000, they were making a desperate play to solve their financial problems while keeping their daughter in the lifestyle she's accustomed to. And you're going to give it to them?" I smiled, watching a pelican dive for fish in the Gulf. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not giving them anything. But I'm going to teach them a lesson about what happens when you threaten my family." "Mom, what are you planning?" "Nothing illegal, nothing unethical. Just a little demonstration of how the game is really played." When I hung up, I felt more energized than I had in years. Charles always said the insurance business taught you to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate every possible outcome and prepare for all of them. The Wilsons had made one critical mistake. They assumed I was just a lonely widow with more money than sense. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect Florida weather that makes people understand why anyone would choose to live here. I'd spent Friday preparing for what I expected to be the most entertaining weekend I'd had in years, and by the time the Wilsons' rental car pulled into my building's visitor parking, I was ready for them. They emerged from their car looking like refugees from a country club crisis. Robert's usual confidence had been replaced by nervous energy. Patricia's smile seemed painted on with industrial-strength makeup, and Brittany looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Perfect. "Monica!" Patricia called out with forced enthusiasm as they approached my door. "Thank you so much for having us." "My pleasure. Please come in." I led them into my living room, where I'd arranged several manila folders on the coffee table next to a selection of pastries from Sarasota's finest bakery. Sometimes the most devastating weapons are delivered with powdered sugar. "Coffee, anyone?" I asked pleasantly. While I served refreshments, I watched them notice the folders. Robert's face went through several interesting color changes. Patricia's hands developed a slight tremor, and Brittany kept looking between her parents with growing confusion. "So," I said, settling into my favorite chair with my coffee, "let's talk about this education program for Brittany." "About that," Robert began, his voice strained. "We've been reconsidering the scope of the program. Perhaps something more modest would be appropriate." "Nonsense. 400,000 is exactly the right amount." I picked up one of the folders and pretended to study it. "Although I have to say, Robert, after reviewing your family's financial position, I'm surprised you need my help at all." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You see," I continued conversationally, "according to these reports, Wilson Financial shows assets of over $12 million. That's quite impressive." "Those reports are confidential," Robert said weakly. "Were confidential," I corrected. "But when someone threatens my son's career, I tend to become very thorough in my research." Patricia's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Threatens? I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" I smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Patricia, yesterday you sat in this very room and told me that if David didn't marry your daughter, Robert would use his influence to destroy his career." Brittany's head snapped toward her mother. "What?" "You explained," I continued, "that Robert's position on Morrison Industries' insurance board gave him the power to ruin David's reputation and end his professional future." "Mom, is that true?" Brittany's voice was barely a whisper. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. "The interesting thing," I went on, "is that Robert's board position is purely advisory. He has no actual power over personnel decisions at Morrison Industries. In fact, according to my sources, the board barely tolerates him." Robert had gone completely pale. "Monica, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Oh, there's been a misunderstanding, all right. You misunderstood who you were dealing with." I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the Gulf where a family of dolphins was playing in the morning surf. "You see, Robert, when you threatened my son, you made this personal. And when things become personal, I stop playing nice." I turned back to face them, noting that Brittany was now staring at her parents with something approaching horror. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to New York, and you're going to leave David alone. You're going to stop calling him, stop texting him, and definitely stop threatening him. And if we don't," Robert's voice was barely audible, "well, that's where things get interesting." I smiled and picked up another folder. "You see, I've been in the insurance business for 30 years. I know exactly how to evaluate risk. And right now, Wilson Financial represents a very significant risk." I opened the folder and glanced at the top page. "Your debt-to-asset ratio is catastrophic. You're 3 months behind on office rent, and your largest client is considering terminating their contract. The only thing keeping you afloat is your father-in-law's loyalty, and I understand even that's becoming strained due to some creative billing practices." Patricia was now openly shaking. "How do you know all this?" "Because when someone threatens my family, I make it my business to know everything about them." I sat back down and took a sip of my coffee. "Here's what I could do if I chose to. I could make a few phone calls to some old friends in the industry, share some concerns about Wilson Financial's stability, suggest that potential clients might want to look elsewhere for their financial planning needs." The implications hung in the air like smoke. "Or," I continued pleasantly, "I could recommend your services to some very wealthy friends who are looking for exactly the kind of creative, financial management you specialize in." Robert's eyes lit with desperate hope. "You would do that?" "I might. If you convince me that you've learned an important lesson about the difference between empty threats and actual power." "What lesson?" Patricia whispered. "That threatening someone's child is the fastest way to discover exactly how much power their mother actually has." I stood up again, signaling that this conversation was coming to an end. "Brittany, you're a beautiful young woman with your whole life ahead of you. Find someone who loves you for who you are, not what you can provide them. You deserve better than being used as a pawn in your parents' financial schemes." "This isn't about money," Brittany protested weakly. "Isn't it? Then why did you only become interested in David's background after you learned about mine? She had no answer for that. Robert, Patricia, you're both intelligent people who got desperate and made some very poor choices. Learn from this experience. Do better. As they gathered their things to leave, Robert turned back to me with something like respect in his eyes. How did you know we couldn't actually hurt David's career? Because I built a career on knowing the difference between threats and capabilities. You had neither. After they left, I called David. It's over, sweetheart. They won't bother you again. What did you do? I reminded them that in any negotiation, the person with the most accurate information usually wins. Mom, you're kind of terrifying when you want to be. I prefer thorough. But David, remember this. The best way to deal with bullies is to be absolutely sure of your facts and never let them see you sweat. Is that why you never told me about the money? So I'd learn to stand on my own? That's exactly why. You're strong enough to build your own life, make your own choices, and yes, even make your own mistakes. I just wanted to make sure you'd have the tools to clean up any messes along the way. As I hung up, I felt the satisfaction that comes from a job well done. The Wilsons had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between having money and understanding power. David had learned to trust his instincts about people's character, and I had learned that retirement didn't have to mean becoming invisible. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought for money or status, but for the people we love and the values we refuse to compromise. The dolphins were still playing in the surf, and my coffee was still warm, and for the first time in years, I felt like the woman Charles had fallen in love with, strong enough to stand alone, smart enough to see 3 moves ahead, and fierce enough to protect the people who mattered most. Some lessons are worth whatever they cost to teach, and some victories are worth savoring long after the battle is over.